Now, why do we care about corruption? Well, there are quite a variety of consequences of corruption, but I summarized just 5, which I consider more important. First, and the one we talk more about, and this is why the World Bank or the IMF are very interested in International Monetary Fund on corruption, corruption seems to be detrimental for development, either directly or indirectly. Now, the way in which corruption is detrimental for development is very simple, at least the direct way, right? Let's say that, I entrust this company with an advance to build this highway, and the company just calculates that it's basically, and of course it is my brother's company or something, it calculates that it's actually better for them to just take the advance and never build the highway, because if you build a highway, you have costs, you're going to have a profit margin, but it's going to be a low profit margin. Far better not to build anything and disappear with all the money, okay? So clearly this is a detriment, and this is why in corrupt countries not many highways get built, or their highways are the most expensive in Europe. In my country, Romania, spends the most money for maintenance of roads than anyone else in the European Union, proportionally. And the reason why this happens is that the country is simply very corrupt, and that officials and companies are tied together like this, and they conspire to have these very high prices, also to have these very poor roads, which need repairs like 5 times per year, because the more repairs, the more money these corrupt companies get. Now, the indirect costs of corruption are also very high. I gave you earlier on the example of IT contracts, and that is again a very good example. Allow me to use my country again, so not to speak ill of other countries. In my country is the public market for IT companies, and today when all the governments are getting e-governments and they are digitalizing, it's quite an important public market for IT, right? And we have all the market dominated by 3 big companies. The oldest one is the company which was related to dictator Ceausescu's secret service. It was the earliest company in the market, and they basically took all public IT contracts on grounds of security, right? They were the specialists on security. So if you go to Romania, very likely all the airports that you're going to go on are securitized by this company. The second, and actually it's going to be very difficult for you to get out of any parking, because in 20 years of monopoly over these airports, they haven't figured out yet how to make a parking automatic cash machine work. All right. The second company which developed was a company of the left-wing party, because they governed the earlier transition and they also took a lot of contracts. And the third one is the company of the right-wing parties, because they eventually arrived in government. And these 3 companies together dominate the market. Now, what do they do by this? By doing this, first, we have extraordinarily bad software systems. If more than 100 doctors put the health card of their patients in a machine, the whole system breaks down, because simply favorite companies do not develop competitive software. They have no reason to do this, because they have no competition. Contracts would come to them even if the software works and even if the software doesn't work. But the most terrible thing is actually the opportunity cost, the fact that a lot of companies in a country which has great universities and which produces fabulous IT people, they all leave. They all leave because why develop a company which would never have any success? Many people do not know this, but actually Steve Jobs, the developer of Apple, developed the software of Apple out of public money, because most of research in IT, that's a market failure situation, has to be paid by government for IT people to invent and develop. And if the market is crooked, talents don't get any research money, so they cannot invent, and favorites also they don't invent because they don't need to. They have the rents which are already insured. So this is how corruption subverts development. It kills innovation and it kills merit in the economic sector. And these are like the main factors which lead to long-term development. The second important consequences of corruption is detrimental for equality in general, but in particular weaker groups stand to lose a lot because they are very discriminated. For instance, women. Women are weaker than men in most societies, and this is why actually women seem to do so badly in quite a number of equality things, from salaries to positions in parliament or whatever, because simply in corrupt societies, people with most power get a disproportionate share. And where do they get them from? From people who are weaker. The same thing happens with cultural, ethnic, or religious minorities. The bigger group tends to get even a bigger share. And where does it take it from? From minorities. And of course are the poor, who are the weakest in any societies. So we say that corruption is like a regressive tax on the poor. Poor people all the time pay a disproportionate cost of corruption. Corruption makes it that richer people get richer and richer, and the poor people get poorer and poorer. The third important consequence for corruption is for democracy. In corrupt countries, people no longer believe that voting changes something. They voted so many times and they were cheated so many times. Plus, alongside them, there are people who, vote for money, who basically get bribes to vote for one and another candidate. So what we notice is that in corrupt countries, less and less people vote. We have a correlation between corruption and low turnout. In highly corrupt societies, less and less people show out for vote because people no longer believe that democracy can solve this corruption problem. The fourth consequence is actually directly threatening the future of countries. Corruption is very highly correlated with brain drain. In other words, exactly those competitive groups, those people with talent who would like their society to operate on the basis of competition, are the first people who understand that it's very difficult to change that, and then they leave. If you live in Europe, for instance, your exit option, as we call it, is wide open to you. You can go and work in another European country. If you're good, you can go through way of university, and after university, you're very likely going to find a job in a non-corrupt country, because non-corrupt countries chase for people who have talent and who are hardworking. But what does this mean? It actually means that the critical mass that we need to build up in order to change corrupt countries is very difficult to build, because it's exactly these people that we need who are going to leave and to go to somewhere place where they are associated. And this is why in the European Union, for instance, the correlation between brain drain and corruption, it's at about 90%. People leave from corrupt countries to less corrupt countries. Finally, corruption is highly detrimental for government capacity. In other words, a corrupt government is simply unable to deliver effectively public services and even to defend itself in the event of a war. Because simply if you are not prepared to perform, if your goal in life is to enrich the people who are in government, you lose the ability of doing so even when your existence is under threat. Now, what you're going to see in these charts are just illustration of this. In chart number 1, you see subversion of merit-based system and this correlation of corruption and brain drain. And the economist Daran Acemoglu said it very well, that societies and economies are like areas where talent is rewarded, and people see how talent is rewarded in their society and learn from this. And if society is based on connections versus a society based on merit, people will simply behave that the way to get ahead is to get a good connection versus getting to a good school. And nobody would bother getting to a good school and learning something if in fact the way to get ahead in your society is just by a connection. Here is the correlation between innovation and corruption at EU level. As you can also see, all these dots are very close around the line. What does it mean? That by knowing the values of one variable, you can predict the values on the other. So they're very, very closely tied. And here is the correlation between government effectiveness and corruption in EU. And you also see that it is a very, very close correlation, right? So in other words, and to sum up, control of corruption is a capacity of a society to prevent its ruling elites from spoiling public resources. In order to understand a bit what conduces to this, I've built this index of public integrity that you see on this chart, or that you find at www.integrity-index.org. In this index, you are going to see a little bit with what control of corruption is associated and with what is not. You will be able to compare your country against other countries and be able, on the basis of this evidence that we research for you, to start building a strategy. To have a good strategy, it has to be different from one society across another, and this is the place to start yours. Thank you very much for your attention.